Well, good morning, everyone. It is about 20 to 10, so I think it's about time to get ready and to start. No, I'm not going to show you slides of Italy, but I wanted to see next week. I'll show you some next week. I just wanted to see how the slides look. I like these screens. I mean, these are really quite nice. Yeah, it's really great. I can actually see things. I can see detail. That's what's wonderful. So, welcome to Bible study. This is potluck Bible study, as we shared last week. This is sort of a potpourri over this fall of a variety of topics and a variety of people. I'm doing the 3-week mini course. We're in class 2 of a Bible study that I'm entitling this uplifting title, Death, Dying, and Resurrection. Through resurrection in there to make it a little more joyful. But that's what we're going to be looking at. And the why. Last week I explained a little bit of why I believe periodically digging into this topic is important for Christians and for people. I mean, first, I think it brings comfort into the lives of believers. I think for a lot of folks, as we maybe look at end-of-life situation or we look at end times, we look at death, it is frightening, it's scary, it makes people uncomfortable. A lot of times when you ask people, when you die, are you going to heaven? The answer tends to come back, I hope so. And that's the wrong answer. We don't want to hear that. No, you can't be too positive. No, this is a good thing. Is that if you believe in Jesus, you're going to heaven. We want people to know that comfort. And I think it's good at times to reflect on that in our lives, that it's not always somebody else, it could be us, that we may be next, but that when we die, we go to heaven. And we'll talk about that next week. The other side of this is also the fact that a lot of times through death and dying situations or grieving processes or catastrophic things that happen in people's lives, a lot of times they become much more open to sharing good news in their life. That is one thing I've noticed consistently in ministry, is that a lot of times people may not necessarily feel that close to Jesus or may not even know him at some point in time, and that through catastrophic situations, grieving processes, the dying process in many cases, people at some point in time in that process are much more open to hearing about Jesus in their life. And so the comfort that we have, if that's buried into our hearts, we can share that with people as they make that journey. So the outline of the course is very simple. We're taking a look at the three different words in the title. So we talked a little bit about the theology of death last week. This week we're going to look at the grieving process. And we'll do that particularly through the work of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, who was she's dead now, died a couple of decades ago, but who did an incredible amount of work with terminally ill people to help us understand a little bit about the process that people tend to go through in grieving. And then next week we'll talk a little bit about resurrection. So before we do that, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to come together again in your name and your house. We ask that you guide us, Lord, as we contemplate death and dying and grieving and all the things that sort of get wrapped up into that part of life. We ask you to send a rich measure of your Spirit in our lives, that we might not only take comfort in your love for us, but that we might share that love, that comfort, that encouragement to others who may be going through grief and through struggle in their lives. It's in your name we pray. Amen. So last week we talked a little bit about the theology of death, which there is such a thing. And when you look at death, there seems to be at least two competing viewpoints of death. There's certainly the secular world, and there is Christianity or the religious perspective on dying and death. The secular world, it's sort of an interesting perspective because in secular society, death is sort of the natural order of things. You get born, you live, you die. You see that. In the animal kingdom, born, live, die. It's the natural order of things. In the plant kingdom, it grows, it lives, it dies. It becomes somewhat natural to look at human beings and say, well, that's just how it is. When you thread medical science into the whole death conversation, it's sort of interesting because in some respects, medical science is helping either to prolong life, I mean the treatment of disease, the understanding of disease, issues that may cause death. Can we treat it? Can we at least stall it? And there is a side of medical science that maybe we can extend it significantly. Generally, when we go on long trips, and I have to sit in an airplane for a long time, I usually want to read a book or do something to occupy my time. And when we went to Italy last month, I decided to read this book called The Singularity is Nearer, and it is written by Ray Kurzweil. I've become really rather interested in artificial intelligence over the last months. I'm a little bit scared of this, quite honestly. And I decided I want to dig deeper into this, because I don't think we know what we're getting into. And so this Ray Kurzweil, as I have come to understand, has been studying and working with artificial intelligence for a number of decades. He's written a number of books. This is the latest one that came out this year. And what he's talking about, if you ever watched The Big Bang Theory some years ago, and Sheldon Cooper, the nerd, would every once in a while mention the singularity. And the singularity, if you don't know what that is, it is when, and there will become a point when artificial intelligence, computers, will become more intelligent than human beings. That it will exceed our mental capacity. I mean, computers could do things really fast, but computers can't actually do what a human brain can do. But there is this point that as computers improve and algorithms that are introduced into it, that computers are able to reason. Will computers be able to have compassion? Will computers be able to think through things and come to a decision? More than simply just the mechanical process that it goes through. I mean, they're working on things like that. That's part of what artificial intelligence is all about. And there is this contention that actually computing power, and I don't want to get off on a tangent on this because this has actually become sort of an interest of mine now, is that there will be a point when computers will likely, or artificial intelligence, will be able to think better. And when it crosses that line, intelligence will exponentially increase. It'll surpass us. And this is where the worry comes in. I mean, will machines then start taking over? Because they can do it faster than we can. They can think faster than we can. And this Ray guy, this Ray Kurzweil, believes that actually the singularity will be here within a couple of decades. The computers are increasing power that fast and making being able to process so much faster, and it's rising incrementally, and that within, I think he's saying 2045, by then at least, we will have reached the singularity where computers and artificial intelligence will be smarter than we are. And will we give them control to operate? Now, this could be a whole study on its own self. But what's interesting about what he's talking about here in this book is, and where it fits into this discussion, is that he was talking about nanobots, if you've ever heard of those. They do exist. Nanobots are now the size or even smaller than a blood cell. They're programmable. They can be inserted into your bloodstream. Nanobots can, what they're hoping as they try to improve this, is that nanobots can be injected into people's bloodstream and they can deliver drugs to the human body where they should go. that nanobots can monitor your body. And if there's a disease, instead of having to go and get injections or go into the doctor, the nanobots seek it out and can kill it. That at some point in time, Ray Kurzweil argues, is that these nanobots will be able to monitor your organs in your body. And if the organ gets, like a heart or a lung or a liver or a kidney, gets infected or gets damaged, it can repair it. And what he envisions on the future as we approach this singularity is that we will, in the end, not only prolong life, but we may be also able to stop death. It's interesting. I mean, I've been fascinated with the book. I'm scared of artificial intelligence. I'll just tell you that up front. It makes me nervous because I think we don't know what we're getting into. And I can see the Matrix coming, that kind of thing where you just really don't know. Human beings, let the machines do it. Okay, well, we may not want to do that. I don't know. So the other side to this is the Christian side, the religious side, where we look at death not as a natural order of things, but as a punishment for sin. And we looked last week at Genesis 1 through 4, particularly chapters 2 through 4 is where this is all at, where God creates Adam and Eve, puts them in the Garden of Eden. He gives them the two trees. They eat of the tree of life. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I mean, he didn't say necessarily not touch. The devil said that. But that you can't eat of that. And it's clear, a person could ask the question why God even bothers to put the tree there, but it's clear we are not robots and machines. We've got the gift of free will. We can make choices and decisions. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil almost had to be there in order to give Adam and Eve that ability to make a choice, to make decisions. And of course, they fall into sin. They were told up front, if you eat of the tree, you're going to die. I'm not convinced that they understood death until chapter 4 when Cain kills Abel. We get it now. Death has arrived. It's sort of the end point of a human's life. As I was putting together the message or this Bible study this morning, I was reflecting on the fact of how death sort of surrounds us these days. We see it all around us, don't we? When I was growing up, and for many of you as you're growing up, we occasionally had a funeral in our hometown. We had a little town. But it wasn't the fact that we were sort of surrounded by dying. I remember very clearly 1963 when Kennedy died, and it wasn't just the shooting part of it, but it was the funeral process. I can still hear the cadence in my ears from him going down, from them carrying him down Pennsylvania Avenue. I remember very clearly 1986 when the Challenger blew up. I was at a synodical meeting for the Board for Communication Services out in California. This happened. We needed to respond as a board to the synod. But to see it in live in real time, the teacher going up, boom, that's not good. Who can forget 9/11? To me, there was a tipping point there because we had entered into an age where the internet was very pervasive, 24-hour news, imaging. You can see the imaging all the time. And since then, we sort of have now become surrounded by the images of death, dying, grieving, all that stuff. It just doesn't go away. Whether it's an earthquake or a natural disaster, whether it's war, the images that come, the aftermath of war, the grief people go through. All these things, we see them populated all over the place. If it's on television, Facebook, it's on social media, all over the place of death and dying and grieving. That's all around us. It happens all the time. And so grieving now is part, I think, of sort of the fabric of what we live in. How do you help people? How do you enter into their lives? And this is where it sort of threads back into Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a fascinating woman. She died a couple of decades ago. She was a Swiss-American psychiatrist, so she was a medical doctor. She was born in Zurich, Switzerland. She grew up there. Her early childhood and early teens, she went through World War II in Switzerland. Remember, Switzerland was neutral. But at age 18, after the war ended, she went with a group of teens to France to help in rebuilding. And she says that she was so deeply moved by the grief and the death that she saw that it impacted her life. She visited a Polish concentration camp, and she said that really was profoundly impactful in her life, that she became much more aware of the grief that people were going through or had gone through and dying. And so she went back to Zurich. She she got a degree in 1957 and came to the United States. She moved to New York in 58. And she began a teaching career. She went to the University of Colorado. And one of the things that she decided she wanted to study was how dying people felt. That when people are in their dying process, if somebody dies, you can't ask them anymore. But if they know that they're in the process of dying, what are you going through? How are you feeling? What are your thoughts? You don't necessarily ask somebody that. We want to help them, but not necessarily tell me all the things but what you're going through, how you're feeling. That was what she decided she wanted to focus in on her career. She went to Chicago in 1967. In 1966, she wrote and published just a 17-page paper, The Dying Patient as a Teacher. Because she had, as she was going into education and teaching, she wanted actually dying people to teach us what they're going through. What can we learn from a dying person? I want to tell you that through ministry, especially in my first dual congregation that I had, I learned a lot from dying people. Listening to them, being with them, ministering to them. You learn a lot. You sort of learn what not to say. You sort of learn what to do. In 1969 is when the book On Death and Dying was published. Her paper became so popular that there was a publisher that approached her and said, "Could you write it a little bit longer so we could publish a book?" This is my copy of Death and Dying, and it's all fallen apart. I've used this a lot. But this is the book that she published in 1969. It's interesting how this book came about, actually. This book has become so popular, it's one of the top books ever on the New York Times bestseller list. And she decided to stop teaching, and instead she wanted to devote her life, dedicate her life to what she described as the greatest mystery in science, death. She wanted to study that. The hospice care that we've got in our country and actually around the world, she was the one that championed it. Compassion became a big part of her drive. That one of the things that she learned from dying people was that they needed compassion. They needed understanding. And she also became very interested in near-death experiences. There's a variety of things that she got into in her life, and this is sort of how it all started about. But the book was published in 1969. It was republished a few years ago at the 50th anniversary of the publication, the original publication of Death and Dying. And this is a quote that she has, because the way that she writes this book, there's a lot in this book where she is, with the permission of the people that she interviewed, where she gives the dialogue that dying people shared with her. When in her conversations with dying people, a lot of that dialogue is in this book, and in follow-up books that she published, because she published a lot of books. And what she does is that she shares with you, she takes you essentially into the interview with her so that you can hear what people are saying back to her. But she writes this, she says, dying has become lonely and impersonal because the patient is often taken out of his familiar environment and rushed to an emergency room. Slowly but surely is beginning to be treated like a thing that has become more mechanical. Said years ago, people generally would die at home. What happens today? We get sick, we get rushed to a hospital. You get plugged into stuff. And I have to say, when I have a kidney stone, I like Carol to drive me to the hospital and to plug me into morphine. That's okay. But when people get into terminal situations, terminal cancer or something that's terminal, is that a lot of times, she says, people sort of get taken into this very sterile, in some sense, isolated environment, lonely environment, where they get plugged in, and they are treated almost as an object. And so that drove a lot of what her research tended to be. So this is how this book came about. And today, still, this is one of the most prevalent models of how to deal with grieving that exists. So in 1965, she was approached by 4 theology students from the Chicago Theological Seminary. She was approached by the 4 of saying, we've got a project to do. In our class, we're supposed to write a project paper or do research on a crisis in human life. And we decided, the 4 of us, that the worst or the most biggest crisis that a person faces is dying. Can you help us study it? And that's actually how she got involved in eventually writing the book. So what she wanted to do was to go in and interview terminally ill people. Now, it's not necessarily that they're in a hospital. Terminally ill people can be at home. They can have to go to a hospital every once in a while. But she wanted to identify people who were terminally ill, diagnosed as terminally ill, that the illness was leading to a near, approaching death. She said that they had no preconceived notions as to what they were going to find or what people were going to tell them. But she wanted to interview people. So she asked doctors for permission to interview terminally ill patients. You know, back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, she would have run into a lot of walls. Doctors don't necessarily want you to interview their terminally ill patients because chances are they might discover that maybe you didn't diagnose it right. That could be. Or that you're not treating them the way, one of the last things you probably would want is somebody to go and visit Marge in the hospital who's terminally ill and she's going to complain about you. So physicians were very reluctant to ever give her permission or these students permission to talk with terminally ill patients. And in many cases, they felt that they needed to protect their patients. Now, today, there would be a lot of HIPAA rules, and there's other things that now go into it. But there were about 200 people that, in the end, they were able to interview. And in 1967, she put together a seminar that she started to teach. And this is sort of the layout. What she would do, that's her, that she would interview patients. Sometimes they would be in a hospital room. A lot of times they weren't. But what she was trying to dig into is, what do you feel? What are you going through? What do you feel your needs are? How can people help? It was a listening exercise in many respects. And in the end, in 1966, she published a 17-page research paper that in the end became the book. So, on death and dying, there are 5 stages that she's identified. The book is predominantly written toward people in the medical field. Initially when this was published, she really thought it was a rather narrow audience. That it would be doctors and clergy, healthcare providers. They would be interested in reading about this. This actually became much more popular across all of society. It became really a really talked about book. What she learned, and probably part of the summary of all of this, is that it is your attitude, my attitude toward death and dying, that impacts how we treat people who are dying. I mean, just think through that. She says you can't calmly and helpfully face somebody who is dying if you haven't worked through it in your own life. That actually the help begins inside of you. Sort of interesting. I've reflected a lot on death over the years. I mean, as a clergyman, I've buried a lot of people. I mean, that's a good chunk of what a pastor's work does. I mean, it's being with people who are ill. People die. You bury them. I've shared with you before, I mean, I've grown up in a family where the Cluth side, the men's side of the Cluth family, they don't live very long. My dad's side, they generally died by the age of 44. I grew up in that kind of environment. And it was sort of the assumption that I wasn't going to make it, very old. I never planned to be this old, quite honestly. We had to adjust our life insurance some years ago because we thought, well, if you're not going to live to be 70, why do we want to pay for this for another 2 or 3 more decades? My dad died when he was 44. His brother died at age 26. My grandpa Cluth died. I never knew him at age 44. When I've done ancestry and worked back into the Cluth side, boy, heart disease was a big part of our family. I mean, the guys didn't live very long. So I've sort of reflected that in my life. I have to say, in my early years in pastoral ministry, I was a rather workaholic because I decided that there was a lot of things I'd like to accomplish before it all came to an end. I mean, I was okay with the fact that actually I might die young, but I wanted to do something with my life before that moment came. Now I've got a lot of extra time to do that. And so what we've occupied it is traveling. I want to see the world. So, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her book has come to an awareness that when you talk to people who are dying, they seem to evidence 5 stages of grief. 5 stages of grief. Now, she's been criticized over the past few decades after she died that actually people mistook what she was saying. I mean, this isn't linear. There isn't a timeline here. Not everybody goes through 5 stages. Some take longer in different stages. What she's saying is that when I've interviewed people that are dying, I see in many of them 5 different things that they seem to go through. All of them go through it in different ways. But when you look at the research, when you look at the interviews, sort of 5 stages seem to emerge. Now, grief. Grief is an emotional response to a major loss. It could be the death of a loved one. It could be a terminal diagnosis. You hear that you got cancer or something else that could be terminal. But grief can also can come out in the significant loss of something. And this is where actually her model is still in use today. The corporate world uses the Kubler-Ross grief model, dealing with maybe a company going bankrupt, you losing your job. It could be some catastrophic thing that happens in your life, that your life all of a sudden it hits the wall and you don't really know what to do. Actually, this model can be applied to that as well. So they've used this in a variety of ways. So there's grief in the Bible, no question about it. In fact, if you look deeply into the Bible, there's sort of grieving people all over the place. We'll talk about a few of those next week. But, and before you tell me, yes, Abel is spelled wrong on the first one. And I sent the slides to Cody before I saw that. And I used to tell students there was always in PowerPoint slides, I always had a misspelling someplace. And I always told people, if you can find it, I'll give you extra credit. So, Genesis 4, we talked last week of Cain killing Abel. There is grieving there. I mean, Cain's scared. Can you imagine what Adam and Eve must be going through? In John 11, we'll talk about this next week, the death of Lazarus. It's fascinating, that story, because Jesus comes. You could question why he delays his coming, but when he comes, he weeps, he cries. The shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. There's grief there. Job, if you want a book of death and dying, it is Job. I mean, this guy, he goes through incredible misery. I mean, loses the crops, loses the servants. The kids die. He struggles with that. I've never gone back to Job, and I was thinking last night, I mean, it would be sort of now interesting to go back and read Job and to see whether he goes through the 5 stages of death and dying in it. But when Job comes to the conclusion is, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, praise God. Really? I mean, it's interesting how the outcome is. He's arrived apparently at stage 5 of acceptance. In 2 Samuel, we've got David who laments, who grieves over the death of a very close friend, Jonathan. Acts 8, when Stephen is stoned, not with drugs, but by rocks. When he is killed, the people that are left behind, the believers, grieve. They're sad. They grieve. A lot of the Psalms are this way as well. A lot of the Psalms are laments. Grieving. Psalm 147, he heals the brokenhearted and binds up the wounds. Clearly, it means people are going through grieving. I mean, David and Solomon write a lot of these. In Psalm 119, the longest psalm in the Bible, my soul melts away with sorrow. Strengthen me according to your word. Help me, Lord, because I'm grieving. We'll look at Revelation next week a little bit, but Revelation 21, sort of this looking beyond it. Is there something beyond the grief? Is there something beyond the sorrow? He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain, nor grieving, for the former things have passed away. I mean, that is the vision of what lies on the other side of all of this that we pray. Matthew 5. One of the Beatitudes is about grieving. Blessed are those who mourn, who grieve, for they shall be comforted. And again, John 11, as Jesus talks to Mary and Martha, I mean, one of the things that he shares with them is, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes me, though he die, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. And then, of course, he poses that as a question to Mary and Martha. Do you believe this? Do you believe this? And to help them with that belief, he raises Lazarus back to life. So the 5 stages of grief. These are not necessarily linear. There's no timeline to this. That's actually what her research has been criticized of late. There's other competing theories that are out there on grieving. This one still is sort of the most accepted out in the world. But a lot of people sort of said that, you know, what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was saying, that you need to go through these 5 stages. No, you don't. That's not what she's saying. She's saying, as I have talked to people and I've interviewed people, I have seen five stages here. Doesn't mean that they all go through all of them. And there is no timeline, that if you're in the denial stage, I mean, you might be in a couple of other stages at the same time. Just understand that people are wrestling with dying, and what she has witnessed is that there seems to be 5 stages that emerge. Not everyone goes through the stages. Sometimes people can get stuck in them. So, let me just recap what these 5 stages are. What you've got on the sheet is the corporate model of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross grief model. This is the model that a lot of corporations use when their companies go through grieving. So that I wanted to share that with you that way. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this. But the first stage of the grieving process that she talks about is denial. And sometimes the isolation that somebody who is in the dying process wants to be alone, isolated. But she said one of the first things that she really noticed in talking with people who are in dying in a terminally ill situation is that one of the first things they say is, no, not me. I don't have this. I mean, especially to hear the word cancer. Can't be true, can't be true. One becomes convinced that actually the x-rays, the tests are wrong. And in fact, I'm going to look for another doctor. I'm going to shop around. This is sort of the shop around kind of attitude where I'll find somebody to tell me what I want to hear. It is typically human, isn't it? I mean, if we hear something we don't want to hear, find somebody who will tell us what we want to hear, you know? And she said that this denial process isn't necessarily bad. That what it is, and again, she was a psychiatrist, so she is a medical doctor. And what she came to understand is that denial sometimes can be sort of a buffer moment. It can be a moment where people in the shock need just some time to absorb this, to process it. And that it's not very helpful to go to somebody who's in denial and say, well, that's not true. And I think as you discover in all of the stages of Ross's work is that what she's really advocating is that rather than trying to impose on people our ideas of what they should be going through, walk in their shoes. How would you feel if you got the news? What would you want to hear? But this denial phase, as she talks about, allows a person to sort of collect themselves, to go through this denial thing. Not me. Got to be. This can't be true. My mother was diagnosed in 1989 with ovarian cancer. Today, I'm somewhat convinced that actually the Johnson & Johnson thing with talcum powder, because she used talcum powder a lot, that she would fall into that. But she got ovarian cancer. She lived a number of months. She died a couple of months after we moved here to Texas when I took the call to Concordia. But I remember when she got the news from the doctor. I mean, and one of the reactions, you got to get more advice. He could be wrong, couldn't he? And back in the 80s, I mean, everything wasn't as probably technical as it is today. Elizabeth says that in her study of these 200 plus people in death and dying, she only ran into 3 people who actually lived in denial all the way to the bitter end. People can get stuck in these stages. But she said, very rarely do people get stuck in denial. That in the end, more hospitalization, more symptoms, you move on to the next stages. The next stage is anger. My mother wasn't happy that she got diagnosed with ovarian cancer. I mean, she knew at the time that there really wasn't a lot of treatment for it. I have to say that the doctor that she had wasn't very comforting. I mean, this is what you have, Dorothy. You're going to die. I mean, he was really pretty upfront with her. But this anger stage that steps in of understanding, I've got this, or this situation has impacted me. Why me? Why not somebody else? I've tried to live a pretty good life. You can see what stage would come next. It's the bargaining stage. But this stage here is the one where there's rage and anger. I mean, look at the alcoholic. Why aren't they going through this kind of stuff? And I've been in pretty good health. I don't drink a lot. I don't smoke. I've got lung cancer. mean, this is where inequities start to fold into people's lives, where they start looking around. Why am I going through this? Why not somebody else? It can also be very difficult for family, for friends, for medical people, because a lot of times people take their anger out on who? The doctors, the nurses, particularly nurses. Get angry at the family. Maybe angry at the tests that have to be done. I mean, I don't mind. I hate IVs. I don't like needles. I don't mind actually sticking the IV in to give me morphine when I've got a kidney stone. I can take that pain. But if you're terminally ill and you know the end is coming, the last thing you want is poke me more. Make me more uncomfortable. Stick me through more tests. And you know those tests. I mean, we've had tests. You know those tests aren't fun a lot of times. And anger can be expressed to other people. And a lot of times when people get angry, they want to be left alone. And this is where, in the second stage, where she really encourages people that if you're dealing with somebody who's in a death and dying situation, put yourself in their shoes. You might be angry too. I mean, you could try to calm people down. Don't be angry. But why? Maybe there's a legitimate reason to be mad, to be angry. And through her research, she really encourages people to try again, to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, and don't go in with preconceived notions of how they should feel or how they should act or how their world should look, because it looks different than it does to you. To me as a pastor, I mean, that's one of the things over the years of dealing with people in parish ministry in particular. I mean, all the situations that you get into with people that are going through suffering and grief and misery. I mean, the last thing, you don't come in and somebody has terminal illness and say, isn't God great? I mean, he loves you. Really? If he loved me so much, don't love me as much then. If he loves me so much, why does this happen to me? Because I've been faithful. So understanding people, and this is sort of one of our underlying things, is compassion that one has for people. The third stage is bargaining. This is one we all do no matter what. You don't have to have a terminal illness to be a bargainer with God. What she discovered, and she was actually a Christian. She was a very active Christian, in fact. But what she discovered in interviewing terminally ill people was that most people, in the end, at some point in time in the struggle, they will bargain with God, the big guy who has control of everything, supposedly. And a lot of times, bargaining is sort of secret. It's private. I mean, who are you going to tell that I'm making a deal with God? Unless you open that up and share with somebody else. And what's the bargain? Well, if you heal me, boy, I'm going to be a different person. I think we probably have all done the bargaining thing. Something bad happens in our life. God must be punishing me. If I change, if I'm a little bit better, maybe he'll treat me a little bit better. Right? That's the bargaining side. It's a prize for good behavior. We know God doesn't operate that way, but why not try it? If your options are running out, this is one way of approaching it. I want more time. I want to extend the situation. God, I will dedicate I will change. What's also built into the bargaining side is there frequently is guilt. And my mother was in this with ovarian cancer. My mother grew up as a Roman Catholic. When she married my father, they became Lutheran. He was a Lutheran. She became a Lutheran. She always believed that God was punishing her for leaving the Catholic Church. She struggled with that. In hospice care, I was still dealing with that. No, God loves you. He's not punishing you. That isn't the kind of God we got. But that's just how people think. The fourth step is depression. And depression is really a challenging stage. And depression sort of can creep into people's lives when they understand the scenario is starting to unfold the way the doctor said it probably would. There's more symptoms that emerge, more hospitalizations. You're getting weaker. It is reality. And when reality sets in, a lot of times that can cause a lot of depression. Sometimes the reality is around medical costs. We know that it's not cheap to go to the hospital. And particularly in terminally ill situations where there may be chemotherapy, a whole bunch of things that can be very, very costly. There could be experimental drugs. People try those largely because I think in a bargaining process, maybe God will be better to me if I do something different. But it may be that people have to sell things in order to pay the bills. It could be somebody has lost their job because they're terminally ill or in a dying process. A whole bunch of things that can unfold that can make people depressed. You can't deny it any longer. It's what faces me is death. And a lot of times the reaction to sad people is to try to cheer them up, right? People are sad, make them happy. A lot of times people in depression, it just works the opposite way. Because it can't be. And so in depression, one of the things that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talks about a lot in her writing, all of her writings, is that we need to become better listeners. Of listening to people, listening to their feelings, listening to where they're at in their journey. Trying to find opportunities to try to understand what they're going through, the pain, the emotions, the anger, the denial, all the other stuff that might be there. Because sometimes there are clues that maybe somebody who is in depression is worried about how to deal with the finances. We'll help them out. Can we help you reorganize your finances? There's a variety of things that might be able to help them, not necessarily take depression away, but to at least help lighten the load. How do you support a person's self-esteem? I remember my mother, because she in the end, she had to be put into skilled nursing. And for my mother, that was just kill me. To be with all of the old folks who were dying. Yeah, Mom, you're one of those now. That was hard to take for her. It was hard to take for us, but it was hard, I know, for her. And to understand, because quite frequently she's saying, you just don't understand. No, I don't, because I haven't been in this situation before. Help me understand. Other times, people just need to be listened to. Sometimes just holding somebody's hand is enough. Sometimes just sitting in silence with somebody. I've done that in hospitals as well. Just sitting there with people to understand there's a presence there. People do care about you. You're not alone. May not understand what you're going through, but I'm here. And I'm going to be praying for you. And then the fifth step, the acceptance stage. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross says that final stage is not necessarily the happy stage. What it does become is that a person has come to an acceptance, and it may be a time when people are just devoid of any kind of feeling. They're just very detached. A lot of times it's that moment in time where you really accept the fate that is ahead. You're going to die. Probably the fear is how? What will it be like? Will there be pain? Will there be the bright light? What's going to be? I don't know really what lies ahead. There's some of that fear and anxiety, I think, that gets into this fifth stage. And frequently people want to be left alone in stage 5. Just leave me alone. There's still some bitterness, anger probably. It's not fair. I remember my mother, she was sort of in and out of the doctors, and it was only in the final weeks that she was in hospice care. She went through all of her belongings, and she put names on it of who should get stuff. Okay, I guess that's part of therapy here. You want to share your stuff with us. I mean, we only had my brother and myself. Usually this is the point where families really need to be ministered to because they're struggling too. Families go through the stages of grief. And they start somewhere in these 5 stages, going through their own grief. And they need to be ministered to as well. So these are the 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Again, not everybody goes through at the same speed. Not everybody goes through all the 5 stages, but this is what Elisabeth Kubler-Ross said, that when you look at dying people, at least what she discovered in all of her interviews, was that people seem to demonstrate these different kinds of stages in their experience. And there's 2 things that really I take away from her work, and it's impacted me as a clergyman, is to be more compassionate toward people. And a lot of times compassion tends to mean understanding people's situations, maybe being a little more tolerant of people's feelings, not to take things as personal. Somebody may be lashing out. My mom was mad at me a number of times. I can't heal you. But to be empathetic. And the empathy part you can define as understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of others. Can I walk in your shoes? Can I understand what you're going through? It takes time to do that. It's an effort. But so much research that comes out to that. People get lost in the 5 stages. What stage is Marge going through right now? As though somehow this is all very predictable. It's not. But can you identify different emotions and different feelings that might reflect a stage and to understand it better? It is climbing into people's lives and trying to be compassionate and empathetic to understand what they're going through and how to be there. There's a lot of other theories about death and dying. When Elisabeth Kubler-Ross died, sort of opened up the field. There's the task model, due process model, all this kind of stuff. And when you look at it in a global sense, they have a lot of what she was researching, only they sort of describe it in a different way, maybe in 4 stages or 3 stages. What I've taken away from her is we need to talk about death and dying before we get to that point. It's not necessarily a comfortable thing to do. I take my daughter out to supper every once in a while. One of the things we talk about is the family finances. I want you to know where stuff is at so that when I die, or when we both die, you know how to deal with it. I didn't appreciate the fact my mother didn't have a will. Everything she had to go through probate in South Dakota. Boy, that was irritating. Now, we could have planned better for this, and we didn't. Do we have living wills? Have we thought through funeral arrangements enough to tell somebody what you want? A lot of times families really struggle with that. I got home in time enough to make the arrangements for my dad, or help with the arrangements. I don't know what he wanted. Never talked about it. Could have. How about the finances? Does everybody know where stuff is at? You don't have to know the amount, but at least know we've got some accounts at Wells Fargo, we've got some stuff over here, and we've got some stuff over here. In fact, I've even got a list in this drawer if you want it, or in the safe deposit box. Talk about it. When I taught a death and dying course at my first congregation, because we were working through Job. Actually, that's how this all happened. We were working through Job, and we got into, because Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's book had just recently been published, and so I took folks to a funeral home. And we talked with the undertaker, because that's a process, unless you're in the process of making funeral arrangements, you don't necessarily talk to the undertaker. And quite honestly, I had some issues with the undertaker process anyway. So I took them to the funeral home. One of the things I really had suggested to people, give some thought to writing your obituary now. What do you want people to know about you? Instead of waiting till people are dead and then you try to figure out, well, what did they do? I don't remember the years they did this stuff. For me, actually, one of the reasons that I've kept my resume active and current is in my obituary. Amanda, my daughter, this is what I did. You can add other stuff in if you want, but these are the years. This is what I did. Write the obituary. And a lot of times families go through stages of grieving as well. We need to be aware of that as well. This is the only picture I've got from my first congregation of this whole situation. I got into processing slides, and this is one of, I was taking pictures on a variety of these. But I took the folks to the funeral home, and they had a wonderful conversation. I mean, they were asking questions that they had on their minds that, when would we ever get an opportunity to actually talk to the undertaker? He took them in the back room to show, what happens, and you might as well know. And the options. They were in the showroom, all that kind of stuff. You might as well experience before it all hits. And then finally, this page that I handed out, this is a page that has become part of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. She died in 2004. In 2005, her son started a foundation, the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. It's in Scottsdale, Arizona. And they have come up with this model to help corporations and companies deal with catastrophic situations in their businesses. This has been modified a little bit. There is actually a couple of other stages that could be added. There is a stage 1. Instead of denial, a lot of people believe that the initial stage of grieving is shock. And then you get to denial. That those are two different stages. And they could be, actually. And that there is actually a stage between depression and acceptance. It's trying to find solutions. How do you deal with a catastrophe? What can we do? And testing them out, which eventually brings people to, it's okay. I can handle this. And so this model is actually used in corporate world. Now, we are out of time. This is typically how I teach, is that there's really never enough time. I try to pack too much stuff into things. I confess that to myself, and it never changes. We will spend at least a half an hour next week to talk and to discuss. So we'll have questions, and I will talk a little bit about, just the resurrection side. There isn't a ton of material on that. We don't really know what heaven looks like, but we do know it's there. We know joy is coming. We'll talk a little bit about the resurrection process and what the promises are. But we'll talk more next week about how do you minister, because actually that was what I was hoping. This can show you just how optimistic I was that we would have extra time. How do you minister to dying and grieving people? We'll talk about that next week. Sorry about not giving you time. Let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for being with us, in our life, for all the things that we go through. Many times those are grieving times, those are challenging times, particularly for people who are facing the reality of death in the short term. We ask you to provide us with wisdom, with the skill to provide comfort and compassion into people's lives, to be there as support people, to hold their hands, to care for them, and to help them through that final stage that ultimately leads to the joy of heaven, to eternity. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Thanks.